today again by our international correspondent, Alex Newman. Alex, thanks for joining us. It's always great to talk to you.
It's great to be with you, Duke. I'm up here in New Hampshire, so.
Yes, you are. You're up in the great Northeast, liberal land, and you're surviving. That's good to know. And you have got another great story. Even though you're on the road, even though you got a van full of kids, you got the whole family with you, still find time to write these great articles. And you've got one that's really a big deal. It's about LGBTQ manipulation of what's going on in your kids' public schools. All the reasons we can give you to get out of public schools, this is a big one. Talk about this particular article and what the LGBTQ is up to.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Duke. And so it was really interesting. One of the speakers up here at this camp in New Hampshire, Dr. Felicia Nace, and she spent, I think, 13 years, she said, in a classroom, and then she moved over to the New Jersey Department of Education. So she got what she described as an aerial view. And she talked about the invasion of this LGBTQIA, whatever, pick your letters, plus agenda into the classroom. And it was fascinating to hear this from an insider's perspective. And I think what really stuck out to me most, Duke, was, she described the motives here. There's this phony agenda, this phony narrative that, we're just doing this for the benefit of the homosexual children, and we're just trying to stop bullying. We just want to teach diversity. What she explained was, no, those arguments are all baloney. They're a fraud. The real agenda here is greed. There are people making money every which way here, including the big pharmaceutical companies that are getting the kids hooked on the hormones and mutilating their genitals, and there's big money to be made here, and the textbook publishers. And that was what really struck me, is hearing an insider's perspective about how all these greedy crony capitalists and swindlers are trying to sexualize and homosexualize and corrupt the children to line their own pockets.
Well, you and I talked a lot during the Common Core era, about 10 years ago through about a year ago, when Common Core was really still a thing, before Common Core had become ubiquitous. We talked a lot about how the textbook companies were the first ones to line up and get all that money. They were they made sure that all the old curriculum was jettisoned. I remember those stories that we used to talk about high school librarians taking all the classics off the shelves in their library and literally dumping them in trash bins, taking copies of the Odyssey and the Iliad and Shakespeare and Dickens and clearing shelves. So all these brand new textbooks that weren't literary at all, that weren't about reading at a higher level, they weren't the classics, they weren't serious books, all of this new teen literature, right? About teaching teens anal sex and transgenderism and bullying and Johnny's got two mommies and endless supply of stuff. And now that's morphed beyond the publishing companies. You've got literally Planned Parenthood with more or less its own publishing outlet getting rich, feeding this stuff into the public schools. Talk a little bit more about that angle.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Dr. Nace was talking about, is how these publishing companies are making a fortune. They include a bunch of LGBT stuff, then the new LGBT standards come in, so they throw out all the old books and they go out and squander millions more taxpayer dollars on bringing in new LGBT books that conform with all the standards. And she actually talked about Planned Parenthood, and she said Planned Parenthood is now going into the schools and teaching the children that they should expect, right? It's like a rite of passage now to get a venereal disease, right? They're teaching our children that they ought to be getting venereal diseases, and this is a normal, healthy part of life. Well, if you wait until marriage, you won't have to do that, but of course they don't tell the kids that. And it gets so sick, Duke. One of the things she was talking about was the outgoing education commissioner. He had a lot of the Christians convinced that he was kind of on their side and he wasn't really going to mandate the most radical and extreme version of the LGBT standards, because they just passed that in New Jersey and 5 other states now. And what Dr. Nace explained was that on his way out the door, they passed this new mandate where now every 8th grade student in a public school in the state of New Jersey is going to have mandatory sodomy lessons. They all got to learn about anal sex and how safe and wonderful it apparently is. And also, she explained that the LGBT, the propaganda is not just in health class, it's not just in science class. She explained that now it's been interwoven into everything. So all these new textbooks that they're buying, the math textbooks, they have LGBT, characters in the questions. The new English books, it's LGBT stories. And so every single class now is going to be inundated with this stuff. And she said the only way to protect your children from this at this point is to get them out.
And you and I, again, talked about that for a long time. We knew this was coming, that the purpose of Common Core was not just in English. Remember when they used to tell us it was just English and math, right? And then you got the next generation science, and now you've got everything completely swallowed up. But Mom and Dad, I hope you hear what Alex just said. They're telling your kids now in these sexuality classes, which are part of their day-to-day curriculum from the moment they get there to the moment they leave. There is no aspect of their day that is free from this kind of politicizing and sexualizing of your kids' curriculum. And they're telling your kids now that they should expect and prepare for the fact that they will have sexual diseases, that because we're going to convince these kids to be so sexually curious, we're going to enable them and empower them to be so sexually available and active that they're going to get venereal diseases, but don't let that bother you. Don't let that stop you. These things can be handled. How far away, and you mentioned the sodomy in the 8th grade curriculum, they are mainstreaming anal intercourse. It's no different than vaginal intercourse. It's like any other kind of sex, perfectly safe, perfectly valid, perfectly legitimate. How close are we to telling kids that, hey, and if you get AIDS somewhere down the road, consider that a blow for freedom and equality. It's a price we're going to have to pay to mainstream homosexual lifestyles.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting you say that, Duke, because we've seen these curricula that are being implemented in these states with these mandatory LGBT programs. We've seen it in California, we've seen it in Oregon, we've seen it in Washington State. I'm sure it's going on in New Jersey. We've talked about it here on the Dr. Duke Show. We've talked about it at the Newman Report at FreedomProject.com. They are now teaching children that anal sex is safe, that it is less risky, right? And if you actually look at the government's own data, the CDC has data on this, even with perfect condom use, there's something like a 30 to 40% chance that it will fail and the child will end up with HIV or whatever other venereal disease the partner in question has. And yet they're telling the children that this is safe. I don't think there's anybody on this planet who would think that a 30% chance of getting HIV or whatever disease the person happens to be carrying, that would be considered safe. And yet they're teaching it to the kids. And then who makes all the money afterwards, right? Then Planned Parenthood comes in. Oh, we'll abort the babies. Oh, we'll give you treatments for the STDs. Oh, we'll take more tax money. Then we'll fund more Democrats. So there's this big incestuous cabal that is sexualizing and perverting the children, making a boatload of money. And from Dr. Nace's perspective, she said, hey, we pay taxes for these schools. We've got to reclaim them. Unfortunately, I don't think that they can be reclaimed. In fact, I think this is the logical progression that this has all been moving toward for generations now. And I think really the only answer for parents who want to protect their children from this at this point, you can't opt them out of this stuff. You either opt them out of the school entirely, or they're going to be exposed to this material. It's going to be normalized in their little minds, and then they're going to live with the consequences for the rest of their lives.
And it is absolutely galling, the hypocrisy of the anti-science left. These are the same lefties, right, who say whatever the CDC says, you follow it. We are the party of science. Shut them down. Just today, the CDC came out and said very vociferously they want kids back in school in the fall. The CDC. We'll see how fast the left turns on them.
Yeah, and again, I think we need to follow the money here. Who is making all the money from this insanity? Now they have a pharmaceutical product that supposedly gives you some kind of protection against getting HIV/AIDS, which is apparently nominal at best. It's PrEP or whatever. And so now the taxpayers are funneling boatloads of money into the big pharmaceutical companies to protect these children who shouldn't be, doing these things in the first place from the diseases that they're being told they're inevitably going to get. I think it's time for a real investigation. Who is funding the lobbyists that are pushing this stuff? Who is funding, Garden State Equality, the homosexual transgender advocacy group that's been pushing this in New Jersey? We want to know where the money's coming from. Is it coming from the people that are going to be profiting from the mutilation of these children, from the diseasing of these children? And if it is there some sort of criminal offense going on here? Is this a conspiracy? We've got to know.
Well, and the old Christian virtue of chastity. It doesn't cost anybody anything. No one gets sick. There's no radical lefty groups cleaning up on it. And the only benefit occurs to the kid and to their God and their family. So it really is a stark contrast. In the 80s, we had abstinence only, what we would call chastity education. And that, again, no one was getting sick with that. No one was getting rich off that. And you see where these anti-science, anti-God progressives have taken us. Alex, thanks for joining us. Important story today.